We're going to be doing the global perspective now, with a special briefing on developments in global defense sector and implications for the Israeli defense tech players. Please welcome Mr. David Chinn, Managing Partner of McKinsey, Israel.
Good morning. First of all, Sean, I think you left us all feeling with a bit of that burst of energy that you brought us from California and that optimism about Israel. There seems to be some kind of munition here, so I'm just hoping that if my speech isn't good, it doesn't somehow go off. But I've been working with armed forces in more than a dozen countries on every continent for the last 20 years in my work at McKinsey. And over the last few years, I've been watching this defense tech, let's call it a revolution, from the perspectives of prime contractors, government customers, innovators, and investors. We are definitely seeing the gradual disruption of the defense industry, whose current form dates back to the end of the Cold War, when in the early 90s, at the famous Last Supper, US Deputy Defense Secretary Perry told the US industry to consolidate in order to enable a peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. And so today we have, in almost every country, a very small number of large primes who to some degree believe it is their right to divide up the spending of the government between themselves and not to let anybody else in. As we heard from multiple speakers yesterday, the government customers are once again willing to support competition in order to get better, faster, and much more affordable systems. We heard that traditional defense primes are too slow, don't spend enough on R&D, struggle to access the best talent, especially for software, and many other complaints. Probably not entirely fair given some of the extraordinary capabilities that they have created, but yet those arguments are true. The question for us to answer is, how does Israel benefit from the opportunity to shape this evolution of the global industry? After all, we're a small country, we have a small defense budget, and we have a lot of problems of our own to be focused on. We have some advantages. They may not feel always like advantages. We have a lot of conflict. Our national service system ensures that our talent is all exposed to the military. And as we heard this morning from Avi, our talent in innovation is world-class. However, this industry is not like cyber, it's not like fintech, it's not like gaming. There's only one customer in each country. It's extremely highly regulated, with strong national interests and sensitivities. To realize the potential of this industry, we're going to have to do things a bit differently. One of the miracles of Israel is that our defense industry exports far more than it consumes. Indeed, 70% of the revenues of our large defense companies come from abroad. I think it's the only country where the defense industry exports more than is consumed locally. For our emerging defense tech industry, we will need to do the same, maybe even more extreme. So we have to think about building companies that for every dollar they sell in Israel will sell $4 or $5 abroad. And that will need everyone to play their part. We can't rely on the companies alone. Government, the established industry, investors and innovators. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that can happen. Others here are better able to speak about the size and development of the Israeli market, of what the IDF needs. I'm going to talk a bit about the rest of the world, and what it takes to make a step from an initial deployment in Israel to becoming established in international markets. While it's early days for this current wave of defense tech, I think everybody recognizes a pretty standard playbook for new companies. And by the way, I think it's also for systems and products from the established primes. Sell and use by the IDF, that critical endorsement used by Tzahal, followed by an export license, not an easy step in itself, a first international sale, and then broader exports. Let's just assume that it's going to be a basic test of startup competence to get that first sale to the IDF. Founders who can't do that are probably going to struggle both to attract capital as well as to export. The challenge we need to discuss is selling overseas. And that starts with where to sell. So Sean put it extremely clearly. If you have something that no one can live without, many of these problems will be easier to solve. But realistically, most of us, when we start companies and when we make our first sales, don't quite yet have a system that is so well proven, so mature, and so in demand that no one can live without it. And so in this industry, founders need to think geopolitics, not just sales and marketing. Because we need to remember that in every country, certainly any country with a defense industry of its own, the government would really rather buy domestically. They want to support their defense industry, they want to create jobs, and they want strategic resilience by owning their own capabilities. So we have to beat that basic instinct and need to buy domestically. We need to think about four things when we talk about countries to export to. Spending, what they're buying, regulation, and openness to startups specifically. If we talk about spending, the Western alliance of countries, or the US alliance, is falling way behind its adversaries in spending since the end of the Cold War. Since 1994, NATO's spending is up about 1.4 times when accounting for inflation. China is up 11 times and Russia is up 3 times. In the US, defense spending growth in real terms is up about 1.3% per annum over the last 25 years. So we are seeing a real shift now in spending. The US remains a country where growth on its spending on defense is slow. That 1.3, maybe 2% per year is probably what we should expect to see going forwards. However, 1% of 800 billion is more than the defense spending of almost any other country in the West. And among that, of that 800 billion, 260 billion is devoted to R&D and procurement. And the US is slowly but surely shifting its policies and its processes to buy from a wider range of suppliers. We see the Defense Innovation Unit with $1 billion budget of its own, the Replicator Initiative with another $1 billion, about $1 billion spent on small businesses, and there are some early signs with the appointments by the Trump administration that this will shift even faster. It can't hurt to have Elon Musk in the White House pushing the defense tech industry. In Europe, spending fell dramatically following the end of the Cold War, and by our calculations, European countries took a peace dividend of almost $9 trillion between the end of the Cold War and today. That's the money they didn't spend on defense, which they were spending before. What that means is that basically most European NATO armed forces are under-equipped, have too little personnel, have almost no depth in their armories to fight for more than a few days, are way behind on many, many areas of technology, And, as President Trump has said publicly, Europe has enjoyed the umbrella of the US's defense. They're in desperate need of almost everything. And of course, they have Russia on their doorstep. NATO European countries are shifting. They've announced additional spending of about 800 million euros for the 5 years following the Russian invasion. Now, fully 23 of the 32 European NATO countries will meet the 2% NATO of GDP NATO spending requirement that was set in 2014, that they will meet finally in 2024. President Trump has been clear that in order to enjoy the US umbrella of security, NATO Europe is going to have to spend a lot more. And there is now common talk in capitals of Europe that 3% of GDP is the new 2%. Just to give a sense, a shift from 2% to 3% of GDP represents another $300 billion a year. Our calculations are that that's between 1 and 2 million employees in defense industry if that money was to be spent in Europe. So it's quite clear that that shift is going to involve substantial imports. And when that shift happens, it also represents a shift from spending on personnel to spending on equipment. It's pretty much impossible even to meet their recruiting targets for European militaries today, let alone expand them. And European countries have shrinking populations and fewer and fewer young people to join their militaries. Poland is a great example, a country that's increased its spending on defense, and its spending on new equipment is 50% of its defense budget. In Asia, the same is happening. Japan is targeted 2% of GDP on defense by 2027. South Korea increases its spending by 5 to 9% per year. And Australian defense spending is going to double in the next 10 years. So in summary, there's lots of spending. We've heard talks also about what people are going to buy. We've heard about the future defense and the changing character of war, the increasing prevalence of uncrewed and autonomous systems, software-defined defense, attritable and affordable systems. And we know that with these falling populations and struggling to recruit, every military is going to need human-machine teams and autonomous systems on the battlefield to achieve the mass needed for the type of large-scale warfare that we've seen both here and in Europe. So that's the positive part of the story. Then we get to regulation. Obviously, it's important that defense policy encourages imports, encourages buying from smaller companies. But policy translates into changes in regulation and bureaucracy very, very slowly. We see each year as the defense budget bills are passed in the US that various kinds of new ways to buy are opening up. And the US is probably in the lead on this, other transactional authorities, middle tier of acquisition, and so on. And there's an increasing set of playbooks for startups, for American startups, to sell to the US DoD. However, for foreign companies, the FOCI regulations, the ability to operate in the US, if anything, are probably getting harder, certainly not easier. Europe has less onerous formal rules, but localization of manufacturing and job creation are often explicit or implicit requirements to sell to European countries. It's one of the few areas where governments can create jobs directly, and especially as it's very clear that European competitiveness is struggling, and European countries need to create industrial jobs as they are struggling in other industries in competition with China, that it's going to be important to be local. At the same time, with the exception of the money they spend on buying directly for use in Ukraine, many of these countries are still adapting their rules to do business with startups. Finally, it's not clear what the exit routes are for investors. We're all here enjoying this defense tech hype, but there hasn't been we haven't yet seen the exits. It's probably true that fast-growing companies with large profits that generate cash will always be valuable, whether in public or private markets, but we are going to need to create a ready market for exits to keep investment flowing. So nothing is easy here. So I have a few suggestions for what it will take to build the Israeli ecosystem. Let's start with the government. Mafat's program to support the entry of dual-use and defense tech startups into the IDF is world-class. There's no question about it. The multiple routes, the bringing down of bureaucratic barriers and so on. But it's not enough. We need to do more. We need to support companies to move from pilot or assessment projects to programs of record. Selling one or two items for a trial or a small number for a specialist use is not a business. And the smart defense investors can tell the difference between a prototype contract and supplying a product that will be used in anger and at scale. The revenues matter, but also the disciplines and regulations that you have to meet to supply a proper military customer. Ultimately, value comes from revenues, and investment will follow revenues. Secondly, further reducing the bureaucracy, supporting with export licenses, and removing the still unreasonable demands for IP ownership, equity, and royalties. Smoothing the path to international markets. Here, Israel needs to make partnerships with its allies to give Israeli defense startups access to the customers with the kind of regulatory reliefs that we have here. This will create benefits for our allies as they will get innovative defense industrial activity as well as to Israel. Secondly, the defense primes. You can greatly benefit from working with innovators, but you need to see them as powerful partners, not a necessary evil. The example of Helsing's partnership with Saab in Europe shows what this looks like. This means reducing your demands to own IP, means not competing with your new partners, seeing the route to share value coming from equity investment, not from squeezing the price. And generally recognizing that the global market is large enough that prime plus innovator together will grow the pie, not give some of your share to somebody else. It has to be okay to give space for an innovator to sell to the IDF as part of a partnership approach. It's a tough shift, but it's going to make a real difference for everyone. Obviously, investors need to provide capital and pick the best companies. And the capital demands of this industry are very high. So we need to grow the number of foreign investors in Israeli defense tech and really help our companies access international markets. And we need investors to help with that access to international markets. There just aren't that many Israelis who've ever sold to a defense customer in any other country. And finally, to the innovators in the room. You need to look more broadly than the tactical problems facing the IDF. Our battlefields have little resemblance to Eastern Europe, the high Arctic, or the Indo-Pacific. In addition to here in the Middle East, that's where the defense of democracy is going to play out. And to make a difference, we need to solve the military and security challenges of tomorrow, as well as those that we face today. In conclusion, there's an important duty and opportunity here to build a great ecosystem to defend Israel and to play our part in the global defense of democracy and freedom. It's a big, big ask, and everyone's going to have to think about how they play their part. And finally, hoping that when we gather here next year, our hostages will be home, our Miloimnikim will be home, and we'll all be feeling a lot more positive about what's happening. Thank you.